Hi guys, so welcome to the final lecture for Chapter 14. In this lecture, we'll be going over some of the responses to the impacts of climate change that we talked about in the previous lecture. So when we talk about responses to climate change, we can respond to climate change in two major ways. The first is through mitigation. Mitigation can be thought of as tackling the problem at its source, treating the root problem. And basically, these are strategies aimed to alleviate or lessen the impacts of climate change, primarily through curbing emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. However, there is also a second strategy known as adaptation. Adaptation can be thought of as managing the symptoms of the problem if the problem is climate change. Adaptation are strategies aimed at adapting to the changes in climate. So whereas mitigation would be things like lowering our CO2 emissions, adaptation might be building walls around the beaches to adjust to sea level rise, or changing our irrigation practices as a result of the increased drought. So adaptation and mitigation are both ways to tackle the problem of climate change, but they do so in two fundamentally different ways. Now, when it comes to curbing CO2 emissions to reduce the impacts of climate change, we can rely on big government to do a lot of the heavy lifting, but at the end of the day, it comes down to the choices and behaviors of individuals like us to really make a significant impact in reducing CO2 emissions around the world. And there are a number of things that we can do. First and foremost, we can change our transportation practices. Transportation accounts for a staggering amount of fossil fuel emissions and CO2 emissions in the United States. In fact, 35% of CO2 emissions come from transportation, mainly through the use of automobiles and other sorts of vehicles. So basically, us driving our cars around has an enormous carbon footprint and an enormous impact on our atmosphere. So there are some things that we can do to mitigate this. We can drive less, so we can live closer to work. We can take public transportation, rely on trains or trolleys or the bus to get to work instead of driving ourselves individually. We can cut our carbon footprint down drastically just by making choices like that. We can elect to drive more fuel-efficient cars, or we could bike to work. Just by using your car less, you can make a drastic cut in your fossil fuel footprint and the amount of CO2 emissions that you emit into the atmosphere. And not only is this good for the environment, this is good for your pocketbook as well. When you're not spending money on gas, you have more money in your pocket to buy other things. Similarly, how we use electricity can make a big dent in our CO2 emissions. Basically, recall that electricity generation also accounts for about 35% of CO2 emissions, and this is because we normally burn coal in order to generate electricity. So there are a number of things that we can do to actually reduce our electricity usage and in turn lower our carbon footprint simply by not using electricity that is coal power plant generated. Now, we can do things like purchase energy saving products, things that are more efficient in their use of electricity. We can unplug our electronics. Fun fact, I don't know if you knew this, but everything that is plugged in, even if the device is off, will actually gradually suck electricity and burn more electricity. So simply by unplugging our devices, we're making a huge dent in our CO2 footprint simply because we're no longer allowing them to suck extra electricity out of the wall. And finally, switching from coal to natural gas. Having a natural gas water heater, for example, can be much more fuel efficient and it can be much more CO2 efficient. Basically, natural gas doesn't actually emit nearly as many CO2 emissions as coal. So by switching from coal to natural gas, we actually are making a big dent in our CO2 emissions as well. So finally, changing a few aspects of our diet can actually have a huge impact in the amount of CO2 that we release. Basically, cutting out beef and pork specifically, or limiting it as much as possible, can drastically reduce the amount of CO2 that we emit per year, or that we are responsible for. Remember that cows and pigs have huge carbon footprints. Recall from Chapter 7 that it takes a staggering amount of water to raise beef and pork, and they also release a ton of greenhouse gases, particularly when they belch methane as a result of their ruminant processes. When they are eating grass, for example, they convert the grass into a substance that they can readily digest, and they actually burp out methane in the process. So eating a lot of red meat can actually greatly increase your carbon footprint just because of the animals that we are consuming release a lot of CO2 and a lot of methane just as a result of raising these animals eventually for slaughter. Now, in contrast, reducing our meat consumption, specifically reducing our red meat consumption, can drastically lower our CO2 emissions that we personally are responsible for. Now, I'm not saying that you should go vegetarian. I'm certainly not a vegetarian, and I love a good steak once in a while. But nowadays, nowadays I'm much more cognizant of the amount of pork and the amount of beef that I consume personally. Instead, I've mostly switched to chicken. Chicken is relatively okay in terms of its emissions. They still release some CO2 and they still release some methane. Just every animal experiences cellular respiration, so every animal is emitting CO2 in some capacity. You and me are every time we breathe. However, chickens take far less water and emit far less greenhouse gases as we raise them for slaughter. So again, we're not saying that you need to become vegetarian. Switching from red meat like beef and pork to things like chicken and fish can be a great alternative health-wise, as well as reducing our CO2 footprints. So going back to our talk about mitigation and adaptation, it's useful to understand that there is no one magic bullet. There's no one solution, and instead we must use and employ multiple strategies in order to tackle this very multifaceted, many-sided problem. First, we're going to look at mitigation again. Recall that mitigation is alleviating the source of the problem. So essentially this involves strategies to curb CO2 emissions to keep climate change from getting worse. Now, the first and foremost, we're going to be looking at energy. Energy is the #1 source of CO2. Recall that burning fossil fuels is the #1 way that we are releasing CO2 into the atmosphere. So switching to clean, renewable energy and also cutting back on some of our behaviors that are more wasteful are great ways to reduce our energy dependence on fossil fuels and changing our behavior so that we use less energy in the first place. By doing both of these, by switching to renewable products as well as dampening or reducing our energy consumption, we can effectively curb CO2 emissions. The second is forestry. Planting forests might be one of the biggest ways to suck carbon back out of the air and into the ground. Remember that as forests grow, as any plant grows, they photosynthesize, taking carbon out of the air and incorporating it into their own plant tissues. By doing that, we can basically create a global carbon sink, sucking CO2 out of the air and putting it back into the ground where it was originally. Finally, waste management. Recovering a lot of the methane that is emitted from landfills, particularly from food waste, is a great way to keep it from going into the air. I don't know how many landfills you've seen, but every once in a while you'll see pipes that are literally stuck inside the landfill, and this is essentially to recollect some of the methane, basically pure natural gas, that is being emitted as a lot of our food waste is decomposing into these landfills. Remember that methane is far stronger of a greenhouse gas than CO2, and it's a very clean burning gas. So if we can recollect this and reharness this to burn ourselves, we keep it from being released in the atmosphere as methane and instead release it as CO2, which is far less potent as a greenhouse gas. Finally, agriculture. Promoting sustainable farming practices which protect soil and land from erosion. This promotes plant growth. It keeps native vegetation in its place and allows natural ecosystems to continue sucking carbon dioxide out of the air and putting it into the ground. Moving forward, looking at adaptation, because we will not be able to mitigate all problems associated with climate change. Climate change will happen. The genie is already out of the bottle in some capacity, and we're going to need to deal with some of the effects. So adaptation, remember, is adapting to changes in climate. Basically, this is managing the symptoms of the problems associated with climate change. The first is infrastructure. Basically, in coastal areas, low-lying coastal areas, very susceptible to sea level rise, they're going to need to install water pumps and erect very high seawalls to keep coastal regions from being completely flooded out. Second is agriculture, and again, I mentioned this earlier when we first talked about agricultural adaptation. This is going to be things like adjusting farm practices to cope with increasing droughts, maybe breeding more drought-resistant cultivars of food, maybe employ genetically modified organisms that can withstand long periods of time without getting any water. These are all different practices with agriculture that we can move towards in order to cope with some of these problems associated with climate change. Finally, behavior. Modifying our water practices to cope with increased drought is a great way to adapt to some of these problems. For example, don't water your lawn in the daytime where the water is pretty much just going to evaporate straight off the lawn and never actually get into your plant. Don't let the faucet run when you're brushing your teeth. There are just a number of different water saving practices that we're all going to have to implement in order to save water, but because the precipitation does decrease around the globe, we're going to have to learn to adjust to that and cope with the diminished water resources. So now that we've talked about what we can do at the individual and regional scales, it's useful to know what big government can do to actually reduce some of the carbon emissions that each country can emit. And this is basically done by putting a price on carbon. There are two basic ways to tackle carbon emissions at the national level. Now, both of these methods are pretty complex, so I'm going to do my best to break it down for you in a way that's very easy to understand. The first method is called carbon pricing, and this is basically using economic incentives to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's intended to compensate the public for external costs. Remember that as we continue to emit greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we're altering the climate. As we alter the climate, we're we risk the chance of losing different ecosystem services as the ecosystems are altered or outright destroyed as a result of climate change. So this carbon pricing is basically a way to compensate the public for the loss of those ecosystem services. The primary way that we employ carbon pricing is through a method called carbon taxation. Here, big government will tax different corporations and entities for fossil fuel use. This tax is meant to discourage the burning of fossil fuels and encourage creative alternatives such as renewable energy as a way to generate electricity instead of using fossil fuels. Now, because often corporations will pass the external costs onto the taxpayer, what the government does is it will take the revenues from this carbon tax and then give it back to the individual citizens as tax rebates so that they are not hurt by these carbon taxes. The carbon taxation is only going to really be felt at the corporation level, and it's mitigated at the citizen level. The second method of curbing CO2 emissions at the national scale is something called carbon trading, and this is where the government sets up a permit system for carbon emissions. Basically, companies can trade for different permits, allowing for different amounts of CO2 to be released, and large corporations, if they need to, can buy extra permits from smaller companies, which can more easily lower their emissions. And this is set up primarily through a system called cap and trade. So in cap and trade, the government sets a cap in the form of total metric tons of carbon dioxide emitted per year that the country will not exceed. What the government then does is it divides this total metric ton amount of carbon into a series of smaller numbers, a series of smaller weights, for example, and divides those up in the form of permits and auctions them off to a series of different companies. Larger corporations end up having to buy more of these carbon permits because they are very big and bloated, and it takes a very long time for them to adjust their practices from a fossil fuel-based economy to a renewable economy. However, smaller corporations tend to be much more flexible. They tend to be able to shift their practices from something along the lines of a fossil fuel-based energy source to an alternative-based energy source far easier. So what smaller companies end up doing is they end up lowering their emissions naturally or through a series of practices very quickly, and then they can sell their additional metric carbon ton permits over to the larger companies, which can less easily adapt to the lower carbon budgets. So in essence, the government will cap the total amount of carbon, and different companies will either buy more permits or they can adjust their total CO2 emissions to lower it to fit within the scope of the permit that they have been allotted. Now, year after year after year, the government will continue to lower the cap and over time discourage the continued use or burning of fossil fuels and CO2 emissions in favor of renewable energy and other energy alternatives. Now, shifting our perspective from the national to the more global responses, there have been several international negotiations that have tried to address climate change. The first was a UN Framework Convention on Climate Change back in 1992, and basically this outlined a plan for reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by the year 2000 through a voluntary approach. So this was the first attempt to generate national support to reduce climate change, and it was simply a voluntary metric. However, this panel or this agreement largely failed due to the fact that it was indeed a voluntary effort. Most countries weren't willing to sacrifice their economy simply for a voluntary agreement to reduce greenhouse gases, especially when no one else was really leading the charge, and so it largely failed because there wasn't really much of an incentive back in the 1990s. We also hadn't really felt the effects of climate change, and there was still some debate whether it was even going on. The second was the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. This was trying to emulate the very successful Montreal Protocol back in 1986. Now, the Kyoto Protocol attempted to basically require the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions through a binding treaty. So now it was a treaty with teeth. It was no longer voluntary. It was trying to bind international support into reducing greenhouse gas emissions. However, this largely failed due to the United States backing out at the last minute. So right before all countries were set up to sign this protocol, the United States actually backed out via Congress, even though the president was all for it. And so without the United States leading the charge, because the United States was a global leader at the time, the entire plan basically collapsed. Finally, most recently were the Paris Accords generated in 2015, which is probably the most far-reaching treaty on climate change to date. Basically, this is voluntary again, but with a global understanding that there is a dire need to curb greenhouse gas emissions. At this point, we are already seeing many of the beginning effects and beginning impacts of climate change. We're already seeing severe droughts, extreme weather events, hurricanes, all of the things that we predicted back in the 1990s. And so now there's a lot more international international incentive to curb greenhouse gas emissions simply because now it's beginning to affect the economy. So again, the United States pulled out because of Trump. However, different states have picked up the slack and have continued to pledge to honor their agreements. And in addition, much of the international community has stayed focused and driven in reducing their own greenhouse gas emissions. They have stayed committed to the process of lowering greenhouse gas emissions, despite the fact that the United States is no longer formally in the Paris Agreement. And again, even though Trump has pulled us out of the Paris Accords, there is some good news in that regional governments and small businesses are actually leading the charge in the fight against climate change. Basically, in the absence of strong national leadership, smaller entities have picked up the slack. California is strongly enforcing cap and trade and doing a marvelous job at it. South Florida governments, in the wake of sea level rise, are working hard to mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change. Basically, they are implementing those water pumps and those very high seawalls that we had talked about earlier with adaptation. Mayors from more than 100 cities have signed the U.S. Major Climate Change Protection Agreement. Basically, this lowers the CO2 emissions from these cities back to the Kyoto Protocol levels, and many entities in the private sector are investing heavily in climate change solutions. So there is some good news. The question is going to be, will we change fast enough? These impacts are already becoming very severe very quickly, and if we don't stop now, they're going to see some really severe impacts. So while there is some good news, the attitudes are beginning to turn. We can only hope that it is happening fast enough in order to mitigate some of the worst effects of climate change. Now, that is everything we have for Chapter 14. I'm sorry that these were very long lectures. However, for the next lecture, we're going to be talking a lot about fossil fuels and non-renewable energy sources. I look forward to talking to you all about that then. Take care.